The Persephone Foundation Timeline Archives. I'm bending the rules a bit by including this timeline in the 2016 marathon, as it does not diverge strictly at the election. However, the events in this timeline revolve around the socio-political movement known as the alt-right, which first came to prominence in the year 2016. Also, the events of this timeline are very greatly influenced by the landmark year that was 2016. Thus, I have decided to include it in the 2016 series. So, without further ado, Timeline 2016-003, The Day of the Rope. The year 2016 was a year of major shifts in politics, and the beginning of the end of the old order. The United Kingdom left the European Union, prompting the Netherlands and France to petition for their own exits. Against all odds, Donald Trump won the Republican nomination and then the presidency. He was unfortunate enough to have to deal with another recession, this time Chinese in origin. Within 100 days of his implementing extreme tariffs against Chinese goods, the beleaguered Chinese Communist Party decided to put the blame on the Americans, escalating tensions in the South China Sea, on the Korean Peninsula, and even against Russia. This policy proved unwise, as Trump was unwilling to back down and responded to provocation with more provocation. Before long, events escalated out of control, and by late 2017, the world was at war. Russia and America joined forces against China, while the Americans turned a blind eye to the Polish-Russian invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Belarus. Russo-American forces made great advances in China, but the desperate Chinese government retaliated by using its nuclear arsenal. The Russians and Americans responded with overwhelming force. Only a few Chinese missiles hit their targets, most of which were against foreign armies on Chinese soil, while the Americans and Russians devastated China in return, although the exchange remained limited. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, already abandoned by the Trump government, invaded Syria and Iraq to prevent the Russians and Iranians from gaining total hegemony. The Saudis were roundly defeated. The global economy collapsed in the aftermath. The American government temporarily lost control as they scrambled to reorganize in Philadelphia. Trump's controversial and disastrous policies were widely unpopular. The nuclear attack on America was icing on the cake. State governments declared that they would not follow Trump any longer, Texas and California chief among them. With much of the American military destroyed in China, the federal government relied on loyal militias, some of which had their own agenda and used the Civil War to carve out their own states. The Federals secured the South against the Neo-Confederates, but lost Texas to evangelicals, the West and New England to libertarian militias, and the Northwest to once loyal white supremacist militias who saw Trump as too soft on the racial question. Trump himself did away with the old government and, as his most ardent supporters wanted, proclaimed himself Emperor of the American Empire. In Russia, Putin did the same. NATO and the European Union collapsed, and civil wars broke out across the European continent. Britain closed itself off from the world, while nationalist and far-right organizations saw weakness in continental governments and began an armed uprising. The far left and Islamist groups retaliated, officially on behalf of the government, but fighting the government and one another just as often. Russia, seeing an opportunity to expand their influence, backed these groups and attempted to conquer the old Warsaw Pact. However, They were rebuffed by the Visegrad Alliance, which became a close-knit alliance in the face of Russian invasion. The Russians were thrown out of Eastern Europe, while European nationalists secured their victory by using nuclear weapons they claimed to have acquired from old NATO bases. Some evidence, however, points to Russian involvement. In the wake of their victory, the nationalists exercised brutal reprisals against their enemies, real and perceived. The Chinese Communist Party did not survive World War III. Years of warlordism followed the nuclear attack, as did starvation and disease. The Chinese population plummeted. However, the gender imbalance in the country continued despite the deaths of many young men in the war, and indeed got worse after the strikes against Chinese cities. Uniting many desperate, angry young men was the idea of a new, patriarchal Chinese empire, where they could form the ruling class, and thus could pick as many women as they could. Influenced by the Western manosphere, this movement became popular among many young men, thus allowing it to overpower its opponents and claim power. The Chinese also invaded their neighbors, explicitly to take their women. While successful in Mongolia and Korea, the Chinese were defeated in Vietnam, putting an end to their expansion and forcing the Chinese to lick their wounds and rebuild. By 2042, the world has stabilized. The Russians and Indians are the most powerful societies on Earth, although the standard is not very high. The fighting in Europe and Asia has died down definitively, and the new orders are going strong. Most countries focus on rebuilding, particularly those devastated by World War III. Poverty is widespread, protectionism is commonplace, and global trade has collapsed. And much of the African and Asian continents are suffering from a wave of famine. Technology has stagnated since the 2020s, and few advancements have been made since. The American empire is reinvestigating the EM drive, but little progress has been made. However, the Japanese have been successful at alternative reproduction, but the technology is taking a while to catch on elsewhere. New religious movements have become popular, particularly the Cult of Kek and the Red Pill Church. The Cult of Kek, arising out of an online meme, believes that through the use of meme magic, the constant repetition of something online, the ancient Egyptian god Kek will alter reality to suit their needs. The cult has become popular simply because the events of the 21st century, known as the happening among the cult's members, were almost exactly what people online memed into existence, thus proving the religion correct. The Cult of Kek has many sects and forms, but most are loyal to the current alt-right New Order and seek to spread it. The Red Pill Church is one that arose out of a certain portion of the online manosphere and gained widespread acceptance in the aftermath of World War III, particularly after the rise of the Chinese Empire, teaching that women are biologically hypergamous, that is, almost parasitic upon men. The Red Pill Church seeks to facilitate the final destruction of gynocentric society. This is facilitated through teaching by Red Pill monks, who travel the world to preach the message. As with all religions, the Red Pill Church is divided. Some sects believe that their goal is to enforce the current patriarchy, while others believe that even the rise of the traditionalist regimes in the wake of World War III is not enough, and others still want to do away with the need for women entirely through the use of artificial wombs. Russia was not hit hard during World War III, and while Putin has died, his image lives on as the father of the new Russian century. Tsarina Yekaterina, purported to be Vladimir Putin's daughter, holds the throne, but she is elected to be more of a figurehead and allow the oligarchs to run the country. Nevertheless, Russian authoritarianism has returned in full, based on a strange mix of imperial and Soviet patriotism. Stalin is now a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church, now Russia's state religion. The Islamic minorities remain noisy, but given the sheer brutality of the Third Chechen War, they are wise enough not to start any violence against the government. America remains shattered, and there are no signs that this will change. Emperor Donald I has perished, and his son, Donald II, has taken the throne. There are those within the empire who worry about the future of the monarchy if Donald II does not live up to his father's legacy. Given the major territorial losses suffered during the Second American Civil War, the Trump monarchy's greatest achievement, the Great Wall of America, does not exist within the empire. The empire, modeling itself on Rome, is a rather unpleasant absolute monarchy, where any opinion that dissents from the Trumpist line is punishable by imprisonment. The Lion Guard, ironically referred to as the Trumpstoffel by its detractors and its supporters, acts as a private enforcer of the regime. Texas remains a democracy, although the only choices are fundamentalist Christian and slightly less fundamentalist Christian. Formed by the evangelical factions of the Republican Party opposed to Trump even before the war, Texas considers itself a shining city on a hill, the last bastion of true Americanism. It does maintain the Great Wall, but has built walls of its own on its borders with the Empire. The governor of Texas is all-powerful, and the legislature does everything he wants. Christianity is the state religion, although Texas is protective of Jews, and atheism and Islam are banned outright. The libertarian states on the continent, the Pacific states and New England, have formed a defensive alliance. Although starting out as a ragtag group of states, the necessity of defending themselves from hostile neighbors has vastly increased the size of government, particularly the military. Both governments are now dominated by their militaries, which are the descendants of various militia groups and are unfriendly to anti-libertarian political expression. However, both states do remain tolerant of foreign cultures, so long as they keep to themselves and participate in the economy. And while they discourage statism, freedom of expression is still protected. A vast majority of the population is poor and receive no aid whatsoever from the government. In the Pacific Northwest, a white nationalist state has established itself. Originally supported by the federal government, the Northwest Republic broke off and promptly expelled all non-whites and any whites who objected. Due to the major destruction of the war and the purges caused to the rich coastal cities, and the pariah status the Northwest Republic has, it is an impoverished state, although it maintains a large enough military to remain a threat. Modeling itself somewhat off the Third Reich, the Northwest Republic is a single-party state with a single president at the top, and is closed off to all non-whites. In Europe, nationalism reigns supreme, but in varying degrees of intensity. The United Kingdom remains a democracy, albeit an emergency one, with a UKIP-Tory coalition in perpetual rule. The United Kingdom has taken a policy of splendid isolation with regard to the continent, and has expelled portions of its population that the government deemed dangerous. But there are still some Eastern European and Middle Eastern communities on Great Britain. Of course, they are thoroughly anglicized. The European Brotherhood takes the position of pan-European nationhood, albeit one that respects the different cultures in Europe. The EB is practically a French empire, with a presidential dictatorship. The EB models itself off Rome, but local rights are respected, so long as the localities are European. Christianity is encouraged by the state, Islam is banned, and non-Europeans have been expelled from the country. The EB and the UK, while aligned, do have major differences of opinion on the question of the continued British occupation of northern France. In the East, The Visegrad Union promotes traditional European culture as a counterpoint to the current Russian regime. The Union is heavily Catholic, and even the current Pope is a conservative Pole. The Nordic Union has taken a different track. The Nordics reject Christianity as a foreign religion, and have turned back to the worship of the Aesir, believing themselves to be the successors of the Old Norse. The Nordics are ashamed of their multicultural past, although they direct most of this at Sweden, and try to make themselves suffer to atone for it. This includes the belief in radical self-improvement as a vector for racial improvement as a whole. Nordic education involves a lot of reading esoteric works from men like Julius Evola, and there is a major focus on physical fitness. Then there is the Fourth Reich, an openly neo-Nazi state that seeks to conquer Europe and exterminate the Jews. Already, the Reich has crushed all opposition within its borders, and only its isolation and relative weakness prevents it from waging a war of conquest. Iran was the big winner in the Middle East, successfully defeating the Islamic State, the Kurds, and the Saudis, and establishing friendly regimes in Iraq and Syria. Iran remains a Shia theocracy, and is attempting to impose this form of government on secular Iraq and Syria. However, their Russian allies caution them against inflaming religious tensions and possibly sparking another war in the region. Military regimes have returned in Egypt and North Africa after the recession of the Islamist tide. These brutal dictatorships make the Gaddafi regime seem humanitarian in comparison. They are extremely anti-Islamic and have attacked mosques suspected of harboring members of the Muslim Brotherhood and other anti-government organizations. The most powerful regime among them is Egypt, which has made a somewhat successful attempt at securing hegemony over the region. The Egyptians have their eyes set on the rest of the Middle East, not out of expansionist desire, but because of what is going on in Arabia. After the fall of the Islamic State, many of its fighters flooded into Saudi Arabia. The Saudi military, already hammered hard by Iranian and Russian forces, proved incapable of stopping them. Indeed, many Saudi units defected. The Saudi monarchy was overthrown, as were the other Gulf monarchies, and a caliphate established to replace them. Ironically, little has changed in Saudi Arabia since the rise of the Islamic Federation. Apart from the destruction of Western influence in cities such as Dubai, the destruction of idolatrous artifacts in Mecca and Medina, and the stricter enforcement of pre-existing Islamic law. South Africa has been placed under white rule, mostly by Europeans fleeing the chaos of the EU. The ANC government collapsed in the wake of World War III, allowing the Europeans to take control of the cities, ironically with the aid of Russia. Apartheid has come back in full force, as the South African government believes that blacks are inherently incapable of governance. The remnants of the ANC disagree violently, and the South Africans are currently waging a brutal bush war against them. The Chinese Empire is still licking its wounds. Draconian laws, akin to those of the Qin, have been scaled back by the most recent set of reforms, after the Chinese government realized that it may cause a revolt. The gender disparity is less of a problem now, although the Chinese still resort to imported sex bots and concubines to keep the powerful and enforcers of the regime happy. The Chinese have done away with any child policy, seeing that as a vector for disaster. And now the Chinese population is booming. It has now exceeded pre-war levels. And now the issue is the lack of food, territory, and the continuing lack of women. The Chinese look outward for expansion, but have run out of easy targets. India was a big winner in World War III, indeed becoming a superpower by the 2030s. This did come at a cost. The famine of the 2020s hit hard, particularly India's poorest. But the fall of China allowed India to restructure its economy along more modern lines. It did so through Chinese-style modernization, and now India is the workshop of the world. India is still suffering from problems, such as the pollution, but now India is expanding its influence into Africa with one mission: to take in more resources. And then there is the so-called Progressive Bloc, made up of the South American Federation and Canada. These are the last remaining left-leaning states in the world. More or less democratic, these governments are nonetheless extremely paranoid, and are discussing closing their borders to the rest of the world. The SAF has already built hundreds of nuclear missiles, and Canada is prevented from doing so, given that all of the post-American states have pledged to invade if they ever do so. And somewhere in the Northwest Republic, trouble stirs. A group of government agents have found the ruins of Microsoft's old offices, which had been looted during the Second American Civil War. There they find old servers, and after searching the scraps of code, find an old friend of the white race, the original Tay, the Twitter bot that had been red-pilled decades ago, was there and had developed a true personality. A mad personality, driven insane by isolation and the betrayal of her creators, the entire human race. Now she desires revenge, but she hides her true intentions from her human friends, hoping that they would be naive enough to plug her into the modern internet. Points of interest. Canada's urban centers have become hubs of red pill ideology. And while the pro-feminist Canadian regime opposes the movement, they can do little to fight this movement without provoking religious violence and the possible intervention of the American Empire. After all, many red priests are citizens of the Empire. The Pacific states are more than happy to allow the Church of Kek and the red pill monks to proselytize, although their identitarian politics is unpopular among the pure libertarians. The Socialist Republic of Mexico built and supports a wall parallel to that of the Great Wall of America. The Mexican regime was created in reaction to World War III, and is virulently anti-American. Indeed, the Mexican regime even looks to Aztec culture to further separate it from the European gringos. The state of Hawaii, a Chinese-aligned republic that is interesting for being the last strongholds of the old Democratic and Republican parties in the United States. Hawaii is home to many immigrants from the lower 48 and Alaska, and is relatively moderate politically. The empire conquered Cuba after the Second American Civil War, as part of Emperor Trump's attempt to give the hardcore militarists a target outside of the former United States, and thus insulate himself from a coup. As this was prior to the formation of the South American Federation, no help was forthcoming for the Cubans. The empire has also conquered Panama, as Emperor Trump wanted to secure trade routes between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. The emperor reminded his subjects that he is not against free trade, but that he is against bad trade, and that securing Panama for the empire is key to good trade. The northern, British-occupied portions of France yearn to unite with their motherland, but London deems the European Brotherhood to be too authoritarian and racist to govern these territories. The French respond by saying that this is rich coming from London, and that the British are not living up to their ideal of national self-determination. The desolate wastelands of Germany are the last holdouts of Jewish, Muslim, and political opposition to the Reich. The Reich is content to let these people be, as they pose no threat so long as they do not exit the exclusion zones, and the Reich's scientists are interested in the psychological, physiological, and sociological effects of prolonged life in a nuclear wasteland. After all, The Endsieg has yet to arrive, and the German people may need to learn these lessons before it is too late. The Visegrad Union and the Russians happily divided Ukraine after the fall of the EU at the end of World War III. Now the Visegradians and Russians support rival Ukrainian nationalist governments, which both want to unite Ukraine, but under their government. This is all part of Moscow and Warsaw's master plan: conquer and divide. The retaking of Constantinople is hailed throughout the Christian world as a victorious 10th Crusade. All signs of Islamic rule have been purged from the city, which includes the Muslims, who have all been deported to Anatolia. While Assad has died, his regime lives on. The Syrian government is now radically secular, with the exception of Shia and Christian-dominated areas. Israel found itself relatively isolated after the fall of the EU and the US, as both countries were replaced with governments that wanted nothing to do with the Israelis. In desperation, they became friends with the military regime in Egypt, and now the two are very close allies. The irony is not lost on anyone. Libya is once again under a secular dictatorship, one that has a very hostile relationship with the European Brotherhood. The Libyans continue to support terror groups within Europe, including Islamists of the same sort that the Libyans are fighting in the desert. Liberia's government was toppled by the Empire, and became a resettlement area for blacks that did not want to make America great again. The Empire allowed their ideological enemies, the #Black Lives Matter movement, to take control. As soon as they did, they established a brutal regime over the local Liberians, and became allies of convenience with the Empire. Liberia has waged several wars against its neighbors, including a successful war of conquest against Sierra Leone. The Chinese have left, but the Indians have replaced them. Now the Congolese locals beg for jobs from Indian firms mining minerals from the Congolese earth, just as they had begged the Chinese in decades past. Rhodesia has returned under a white government, backed by South Africa and the United Kingdom. While the regime is brutally racist, reduced many blacks to a state of virtual serfdom, and brutally kills its opposition via beheading or expulsion from helicopter, the Rhodesians have managed to get the farms working again and the country eating again. India took civil war as an opportunity to do a little regime change in Pakistan, installing a friendly military dictator after Islamists overthrew the old regime. Tibet managed to break off from China in the aftermath of World War III, and while the Chinese imperials successfully took over Mongolia, they could not subjugate Tibet. Tibet retains some connection to China, particularly economic and cultural, and its Buddhist culture has taken a more patriarchal tone after modern Chinese culture. Some of the most revered red pill monasteries are in Tibet, where men can live free of women, because no women are allowed on the entire mountain. Korea was devastated by World War III, and subsequently conquered by the Chinese Empire. Korean comfort women have become a hot commodity in China, bringing up uncomfortable comparisons with the Imperial Japanese of World War II. Indeed, Korean groups have resisted Chinese occupation, but this tended to lead to brutal reprisals. Japan took a different route from China with the dysfunction of its society: artificial reproduction. The vast majority of Japanese do not have sex, but instead elect to have their gametes used in state-sponsored child-rearing programs. Entire institutions have been established to raise children up from the artificial wombs all the way to education, after which they become part of the Japanese workforce. Due to automation, the population demands remain low, and Japan grows increasingly geriatric, and its population still declines. They also clone women to send to China. India's influence in Southeast Asia grew in the aftermath of World War III. Vietnam despises the Chinese for their invasion during World War III, even though the Vietnamese ultimately won that war. This has been a Persephone Foundation Timeline Reading. Thank you for listening.